Almighty God, who in your wisdom and goodness has appointed the office of rulers and parliaments for the welfare of society and the just government of men and women, we beseech you to behold with your abundant favor us, your servants, whom you have called to the performance of important trusts in these islands. Father, let your blessing descend upon us here assembled, and grant that we may treat and consider all matters that shall come under our deliberation in so just and faithful a manner as to promote your honor and glory, and to advance the peace, prosperity, and welfare of these islands and of those whose interests you have committed to our charge. And this we beg in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. Be seated. Item number 2, the minutes of the 24th of July, 2019.
Madam President.
Senator Jardine, you have the floor.
Madam President, I move that consideration of the minutes of the meeting of Wednesday, the 24th of July, 2019 be deferred.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. The minutes are deferred. Item number 3, messages.
No messages, Madam President.
Thank you, Clark. Item number 4, reports of committees. There are none. Item number 5, announcements. There are none. Item number 6, notices of motion. The first motion is Pension War Service Order 2019. Senator Campbell, you have the floor.
Madam President, I hereby present for the consideration of Senate the draft order entitled the Pensions War Service Order 2019, proposed to be made by the Minister responsible for defense under the provisions of Section 16A of the Pensions and Gratuities War Service Act 1947. And I give notice that at a later point in the meeting, I will move that the said draft order be approved.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Thank you, Senator Campbell. The second one is the Money Service Business Order 2019, and that is yours as well. You
That's
have
correct,
the floor,
Madam
Senator
President.
Campbell.
Madam President, I hereby present for the consideration of Senate the draft order entitled the Money Service Business Order 2019, proposed to be made by the Minister of Finance under the provisions of Section 11(7) of the Money Service Business Act 2016. And I give notice that at a later point in the meeting, I will move that the said draft order be approved.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Thank you, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam President.
Item number 7, petitions. We have one petition, the Stand Prop Limited. Senator Campbell, it's yours again.
That's correct, Madam President.
You have the floor.
Madam President, I hereby present the following petition, the petition of Stand Prop Limited, a company incorporated on the 26th of October 2012 in Bermuda, pursuant to provisions of the Companies Act 1981, requesting the enactment of provisions to enable Stand Prop Limited to discontinue out of Bermuda, as more particularly set out in the draft private bill entitled Stand Prop Limited Act 2019, which accompanies the petition. Madam President, I move that the said petition be referred to the Parliamentary Joint Select Committee on Private Bills for consideration and report.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. It will be sent to the Private Bills Committee. Thank you, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam President.
Item number 8, statements. We have a statement on the Law Reform Commission. Senator Kathy Lynn Simmons, AG and Government Leader.
Good morning, and thank you,
Good
Madam
morning.
President. Madam President, since 1968, Bermuda has had an ad hoc law reform committee appointed by the Attorney General, which was initially a cabinet subcommittee. However, in 2009, the Progressive Labour Party government acknowledged the need to establish a statutory law reform commission to engage in continuing and systematic law reform. Madam President, in advancing the establishment of a law reform commission, Commonwealth best practice suggested that the process of law reform is most effectively led by a permanent body with a clearly defined role whose existence and independence have statutory support. A review of Commonwealth practice carried out during the development of the Law Reform Commission legislation in 2009 indicated that a wide range of Commonwealth countries, large and small, developed and developing, had law reform agencies with the following broad characteristics. They were established by statute, they have promulgated mission statements asserting their independence of government and committed to secure input from the lay public, they have websites and or web pages to facilitate public outreach, and they were members of the Commonwealth Association of Law Reform Agencies. While the position in all British overseas territories was unclear, the British Virgin Islands, Cayman, and Jersey, which were less constitutionally developed than Bermuda, had all established law reform agencies on that basis. It was unarguably clear that Bermuda lagged behind international best practice previously in establishing an independent statutory law reform agency. Ultimately, Madam President, Bermuda adopted legislation in the form of the Law Reform Commission Act 2009, which reflected the best provisions of both the BVI and Cayman Islands legislation and made provision for the establishment of an independent Law Reform Commission. The Law Reform Commission Act 2009 came into operation on February 4, 2011. Madam President, as provided for under the Act, the Commission consists of a chairman and between 4 and 7 commissioners who, in the opinion of the Governor, are suitable for appointment by reason of their qualifications, training, and experience. The commissioners are appointed by the Governor, having been nominated for appointment by at least 2 of the following, namely the Attorney General, the Chief Justice, and the President of the Bar Council. Madam President, I am pleased to inform Senators that on nomination of the Chief Justice and myself, the Governor has appointed as Chairman of the Law Reform Commission Senior Attorney Mr. Delroy Duncan. 5 commissioners have been appointed: former Attorneys General the Honorable Michael Scott MP and Mr. Mark Pettingale, and lawyers Mr. Rod Wright Sterling, Ms. Kim Wilkerson, and Ms. Jacqueline McClellan. All appointees bring a wealth of experience and commitment to advancing the much-needed reform of Bermuda's laws. Madam President, the functions of the Commission are to study and keep under review the laws of Bermuda with a view to their systemic development and reform. Particular functions of the Commission, as prescribed under Section 6 of the Act, include development of the law with the aim of making it more responsive to the changing needs of Bermudian society, the adoption of new or more effective methods for the administration of the law and the dispensation of justice, ensuring that the law of Bermuda is in conformity with the Bermuda Constitution and with international treaty obligations, and making recommendations to the Minister for the elimination of anomalies in the law, the repeal of obsolete and unnecessary acts of provision of an act, and the simplification and modernization of the law. Madam President, in the performance of its functions, the Commission may review and consider any proposals for the reform of the law which may be referred to it by any person or authority, initiate and carry out or direct the initiation and carrying out of studies and research necessary for the improvement and modernization of the law, prepare and submit to the Minister from time to time a program for the study and examination of any branch or area of the law with a view to making recommendations for its improvement, modernization, and reform, undertake, pursuant to any such recommendations approved by the Minister, the formulation and preparation of draft legislation, provide at the instance of any ministry, department, or agency of the Government of Bermuda proposals for reform or amendment of any branch or area of the law, and appoint or empanel committees, whether from among the members of the Commission, including the Chairman, or from among persons outside the Commission, or both, to study and make recommendations to the Commission on any aspect of the law referred to it by the Commission. Madam President, the staff of the Commission will consist of a public officer who will be the Director of the Commission and such public officers as are necessary to carry out the work of the Commission. The Director is responsible for the administration of the Commission and performs functions as assigned by the Commission. In addition, a Parliamentary Council will be assigned to assist the Commission and government departments with the studies and research necessary to make recommendations to the Minister for the improvement, modernization, and reform of the law. The preparation of draft legislation on behalf of the Commission will also be the responsibility of Parliamentary Council responsible for law reform. In addition, Madam President, the Act makes provision for the Minister to engage consultants and experts who will be paid such remuneration as the Minister approves to assist the Commission in the performance of its functions. The expenses of the Commission will be met out of funds to be appropriated annually by the Legislature. It is intended to use existing resources to support the Commission during this initial stage. During the remainder of this fiscal year, the expenses of the Commission will be monitored and assessed to determine the level of funding to be appropriated during the next budget. Madam President, the Commission is required to submit a report to the Minister on the results of any study it undertakes or directs. The report must include its recommendations and may even include draft legislation. Further to this report, Madam President, by April 1st of each year, the Act requires the Commission to prepare and submit to the Minister a report containing a summary of its activities for the preceding year, in addition to any information the Commission considers to be appropriate. The report must include any proposals for the reform of the law that have either been made by the Commission or referred to it by any person or authority. The report must indicate which proposals are being worked on by the Commission, a timetable for completion, as well as details of any proposals that have been rejected as being unsuitable for study and the reasons for rejection. Finally, Madam President, the Minister must cause the report to be laid before both houses of the legislature. Madam President, in closing, this government acknowledges the need for comprehensive and systemic reform of Bermuda's law is as urgent today as it was in 2009 when a formalized law reform body was conceived. Therefore, I am pleased today to inform senators and members of the public that we are advancing this initiative. Over the next several weeks, the contact information for the Commission and how persons can make submissions will be provided. I would like to take this opportunity, Madam President, to thank the Chairman and the Commissioners for their willingness to serve in these very important roles. I have no doubt that their excellent qualifications, experience, and commitment to the law reform will advance our collective best interests. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen Simmons, AG, and Government Leader in the Senate. Moving on, item number 9, introduction of bills. There are none. Item number 10, the first reading of public bills. The following public bills have been received from the Honorable House of Assembly and are read for the first time. Their titles are respectively the Corporate Service Provider Business Amendment Act 2019, the Trust Regulation and Trust Business Amendment Act 2019, the Insurance Amendment Act 2019, and the Chartered Professional Accountants Amendment Act 2019, and these bills will be taken up in the orders of the day. Item number 11, the first reading of private bills. There are none. Item number 12, question period. Senators, if any senator want to ask any questions on the bill that has been read by the AG with the ministerial statement, I beg your pardon, that you have just received on Law Reform Commission. No one wants to raise questions? Thank you. Moving on, item number 13, orders of the day. The first order of the day is the second reading of the Public Service Superannuation Amendment Act. Senator Kathleen Simmons, AG. Oh, I beg your pardon. I saw you reaching. Senator Campbell, I do beg your pardon.
Thank you, Madam President.
You have the floor. This is your bill.
Madam President, I move that the bill entitled the Public Service Superannuation Amendment Act 2019 be now read a second time.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, government wishes the Senate now to give consideration to the bill entitled the Public Service Superannuation Amendment Act 2019. The bill seeks to increase the age of compulsory retirement on a voluntary basis from 65 to 68 years for certain public officers, not including police, fire, prison officers, members of the Royal Bermuda Regiment, and teachers, and to make related amendments. Madam President, senators are aware that Bermuda, like most of the developed world, is faced with the challenges associated with the growth of an aging population. The results of the projected population for the period 2017 to 2067, 50 years, illustrates that the number of working age persons, 20 to 64, are expected to decline from 40,099 to 25,296, a decrease of 14,803, or 37%. This fall in the numbers of working age is due to the lower birth rate experienced in recent years and the projected continuation of a low birth rate. The numbers of persons over the current pension age, 65, are expected to increase from 11,080 to 16,186, an increase of 5,106, or 46%. The projected ratio of the number of working age to the number of over pension age, the pensioner support ratio, is projected to fall from 3.6 to about 1.6. Madam President, this phenomenon is not too dissimilar with what is being experienced in other parts of the developed world. Madam President, to address what is clearly one of the most important demographic issues of the 21st century, it is important that governments prepare early. To this end, senators will recall that in the 2018 speech from the throne, the government undertook that the legislature will be invited to discuss options for such revisions to the age of mandatory retirement from the public service, which will preserve the right to retire at 65, but permit a post holder to work beyond that age without the requirement for permission to do so. Madam President, this was a promise made in the speech from the throne and is a promise that has been kept. Madam President, in the lead up to the tabling of this legislature, the Premier, the Honorable David E. Burt, JP MP, in keeping with the promise to invite the legislature to discuss options for such revisions to the age of mandatory retirement from the public service, tabled a motion on the 10th of May inviting those that sit in another place to agree the recommendations of the report of the Labor Advisory Subcommittee entitled Reviewing the Retirement Age, which was also tabled on the 10th of May. Madam President, as was observed in November's speech from the throne, in many cases, the designation senior citizen does not describe our energetic men and women age 65 and older. In most countries, retirement is coming to be viewed as a time of personal reinvention and new opportunities rather than withdrawal and winding down. In addition, there is also a global consensus that old age is no longer determined by traditional markers imposed by society, such as how many birthdays a person has had, or whether a person has retired or has received a pension check. Instead, personal ability is considered to be the key determinant of age. Madam President, the above report provided useful facts, and the recommendations from this report were as follows. 1, create a single piece of legislation that sets a retirement age, a pensionable age, and allows for reemployment provisions. The aims of the legislation will be 1, gradually increase the retirement and pensionable age simultaneously from 65 to 70 over a 10-year period, with the retirement age moving to 68 within a 5-year period. 2, allow for annual reemployment contracts to be utilized for 5 years after the prescribed retirement age. 3, ensure early retirement provisions are in place for workplace pensions, and the contributory pension fund payments. 4, ensure employers are not prevented from retaining older employees for as long as is desired by the employer after the retirement and reemployment periods. 2, it is designed to create legislation or utilize existing legislation to prohibit age discrimination in the world of work pertaining to older workers, ensuring equality in recruitment, hiring, compensation, benefits, training, workplace conditions, and career development. And lastly, to create a financial and retirement planning toolkit which can be utilized by employers, workers, and community stakeholders to increase financial levels of the workplace. Madam President, as previously advised in the first instance, the Policy and Strategy section within the Cabinet Office will work with the committee, unions, churches, sports clubs, and other key constituencies to implement the financial and retirement planning toolkit recommended by the report. The report provided useful facts and figures, and the key policy objectives of the recommendations were as follows: to stabilize pension funds, to allow working men and women the benefit of greater capacity to earn, and therefore better prepare for their eventual retirement, and to use the longer lifespan in the modern era to the benefit of the society and the people of Bermuda. Madam President, senators will recall the comprehensive and thoughtful debate in another place on the 31st of May, during which general support on this matter was portrayed. And to Madam President, the purpose of this amendment is to provide for the following: require contributors, as defined under the Act, save for police officers, fire officers, prison officers, and teachers, to compulsorily retire at 68 years of age. To permit contributors, as set out in 1 above, to voluntarily retire at 65 years of age retaining also the ability of contributors as set out in one above to retire at 60 years of age. Remove the discretion of the head of public service in permitting a contributor who has reached the age of compulsory retirement to continue in the public service until the later age, not exceeding the age of 70 years. Permit contributors as set out in one above to continue in the public service until a later age, not exceeding the age of 70 years, subject to an annual certification of medical fitness and the confirmation of their head of department to the permanent secretary of the relevant ministry that the contributor is competent to fully discharge the duties of the post. To confirm that where a contributor has reached the age of compulsory retirement and continues in the public service, having not retired, he or she shall continue to contribute to the fund, shall not receive their pension until such time as they have retired from the public service, and shall continue to accrue any benefit to which they are entitled on continuing to contribute to the fund after reaching the age of compulsory retirement. Madam President, senators should note the proposed amendments meet the policy objectives contained in the 2018 speech from the throne, which were to revise the mandatory retirement age to take account of a longer lifespan, the necessity to add additional stability to pension funds, and to promote greater choice among the working population about when one retires from full-time employment. Also, it is important to note that, consistent with Section 91 of the Bermuda Constitution Order 1968, these amendments do not create any pension terms less favorable to officers in the public service than the law or laws in force at the time when they were engaged as public officers. Madam President, senators should also be advised that the Ministry of Finance asks the actuary to consider the impact on the fund of allowing members to retire at 67 on a volunteer basis. The actuary found that this change would not have a material impact on the fund. Madam President, in their 2018 report, the Fiscal Responsibility Panel also recognized that there was a need to raise the retirement age. Madam President, the proposals contained in this legislation are reflective of changing demographics of Bermuda's population, which must be mitigated by the ability of people to work for longer and contribute to a fund that supports public officers in retirement. Madam President, senators are advised that an increase in the age of retirement for uniformed service personnel and teachers will be the subject of a fulsome consultative effort with the service chiefs and the representative unions. Before closing, Madam President, I would like to look at the key clauses in this act, if you don't mind, Madam President.
Certainly. Continue.
Madam President, Clause 2 amends Section 12 of the Principal Act, currently subsection 3, provides that a person whose first employment with the government commences after he has attained the age of 57 years shall not contribute to the fund or be entitled to any benefit under the Principal Act unless he elects to contribute to the fund. This will continue to apply to teachers. New subsection 3A increases the relevant age from 57 to 60 years for contributors other than teachers in consequence of the increased age of compulsory retirement for such persons affected by Clause 3. Subsection 4 is substituted to include an election under subsection 3A and simplified as former paragraph A is spent. Clause 3 amends Section 22(2) of the Principal Act to increase from 65 to 68 years the age of compulsory retirement for public officers to whom that subsection applies, which does not include police officers, fire officers, prison officers, members of the Royal Bermuda Regiment, and teachers. Clause 4, Madam President, amends Section 24 of the Principal Act by inserting new subsection 3A, which provides for automatic deferral of a contributor's pension until he ceases to be employed in the public service for contributors falling within Section 22.2, i.e. not uniformed officers and teachers. This replaces the right to elect deferral for such persons who continue in employment after the age of compulsory retirement, which was introduced by the Public Service Superannuation Amendment Act 2007. Clause 5 amends Section 32.2 of the Principal Act, pension to begin to accrue the day after attaining age of compulsory retirement if person or persons do not elect to defer pension until retirement under Section 24.3, so that it no longer applies to contributors falling within Section 22.2, in consequence of the amendments made to Section 24 of the Principal Act by Clause 4. Lastly, Madam President, Clause 6, subsection 1 makes transitional provision in relation to amendments to Section 12 of the Principal Act by Clause 2. Subsection 2 specifies the persons to whom amendments to Sections 24 and 32 of the Principal Act, made by Clauses 4 and 5, apply to ensure amendments comply with Section 91 of the Constitution. And lastly, Clause 7 provides for the commencement, Madam President. In closing, Madam President, it is important to note that in order to solve the aging population dilemma in a holistic manner, we must first and foremost recognize that this is more than an issue of Social Security and pension plan benefits and taxes. Fundamentally, it is a question of finding ways to improve economic growth and integration. With those introductory remarks, Madam President, I now conclude my initial remarks. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Campbell. And before I open it to senators, I would just like to acknowledge the presence of the Financial Secretary, Mr. Anthony Manders, in the chamber, as well as Mrs. Miriam Rogers, who's the Parliamentary Counsel. Welcome to you all. Would any senator care to speak on this bill? Senator Kemp, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Senator Campbell, for introducing the bill. I guess there's some two sides to the argument about the retirement age. From one side, obviously, we have a country with a demographic projection that's skewing towards an average older age. So, of course, the strains on our pension funds are going to be significant, and there's people who are struggling when they get to 65 and may wish to or need to keep working, either to stay active or to fund our longer life expectancies and what's needed down the line. The other half of it, of course, is young people trying to access the workforce, finding less openings being available, and, of course, the burden. I know we're talking about public service here, but also on employers when, especially after the 2010 downturn, that needed to lighten their workforce. And obviously, if there was a mandatory retirement age, that was a way to go about it without necessarily having to go through a whole bunch of redundancy payments and this sort of thing. I noticed Senator Campbell spoke about, I guess, looking for holistic approaches, and also a promise about people being able to work for longer without permission being needed to do so. So I guess that brings me to a couple comments and a question. And I'll start with the question. On Section 3BB, I guess, of the provision of the amendment. So on page 2, it amends Section 22, and it inserts that once you go 65, you'll need to provide a medical fitness report to say that you're physically or mentally capable to perform the roles in the job. However, it also says that it's going to be subject to annual confirmation by the contributor's head of department to the relevant permanent secretary that the contributor, and here's the key bit, that the contributor is competent to discharge the duties of the post. So when we talk about without needing permission to do so, this clause specifically seems to me that you do require permission to continue to work, and that's from your, basically your superior or your supervisor or whatever, in the respective role. So I guess my question is, so what comes down to this? If the previous iteration of the Public Service Superannuation Act basically forced people to retire at 65, and therefore it being retirement, there's no redundancy payout for years worked. So what happens if you want to keep working and your doctor says you're capable to keep working, but the permanent secretary or the head of department to that relevant permanent secretary says that you're not the right person anymore? Is that considered a redundancy? Is it considered a retirement? So I'd certainly like some answers around that and how that plays out to payout costs to the government in this case. What I will ask is also, seeing as this aging demographic and obviously the pension challenges are more with the public service as opposed to private sector pensions, but still the aging demographic and how we're going to affront that as a country is something that needs to be had. In the Employment Act, there is no mandatory retirement age. So any mandatory retirement that people have in the private sector is because it's been expressly included in their employment contract. Now, some companies do have that, some don't, because age discrimination is not covered under the Human Rights Act. But my question is this model seems like it could work in a broader sense, whereby if there was a mandatory retirement age, that after a certain age, both employer and employee have a mechanism that's the same across the board, whereby someone may at a certain point just want to work a few less hours or do whatever, but still want to keep working. And for an employer, it's tough to manage the weight of, say, 10, 20 years of accumulated redundancy, or 13, I guess, where it maxes out, and the need to also promote internally and do this kind of thing when people are waiting for opportunities to open up. So I'd like to know, would this similar sort of mechanism be considered for the Employment Act, and what happens when someone wants to keep working past 65, is physically fit according to a doctor, but their supervisor says you're not competent to discharge the duties of the post? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kemp. Would any other senator care to speak on this bill? Senator Jardine, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam President, listening audience. I support this legislation, not just because I'm over 68, but because I think there are many of us who are well capable of working beyond 65, and I think this allows for that. Also, not just because the Fiscal Responsibility Panel recommended, but also the SAGE Commission, upon which I served on the subcommittee dealing with pensions. And one of the recommendations that we did make at the time was to increase the retirement age beyond currently at 65. So I think these are all steps heading in that direction. There are also a whole lot of other recommendations contained in the SAGE report dealing with pensions, which I hope government will look at in due course. I know they have adopted some of them, but it is a continuing process. So I do support this bill. I had one question, and it's really a point of clarification, I guess. I listened to the senator's presentation, and I was trying to find out whether once you reach the age of 68 and you've given permission to continue to work to age 70, do you continue to contribute to the PSSF, or does that actually cease once you reach 68, regardless of whether you continue to work or not? So let me put that another way. If I'm continuing to work to age 70, do I have to make contributions to the PSSF during that 2-year period of time? And that is the one question of clarification that I had. Apart from that, Madam President, I do support the bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Jardine. Would any other senator care to speak on this bill? Senator Hayward, you have the floor.
Good morning, Madam President.
Good morning.
Madam President, I wholeheartedly welcome this bill that is put forward by the government. I was responsible for chairing the LAC subcommittee who explored this whole topic regarding the retirement age and age discrimination. And it was the committee in which I chaired that provided the recommendations that Senator Campbell read before us today. The first thing the committee done was diagnose whether or not there is a problem. And we recognize that there is a problem. Senator Campbell highlights some of the challenges regarding the financial hardship that persons do have, transitioning from a working individual to a pensioner. We also recognize that there were problems with the funding of our public service pension fund, and we asked ourselves, would changes in that direction assist with the problem? The other thing we had to recognize was that Bermuda's population is aging. And so the demographic makeup of our population is changing, and is rapidly changing to our Asian population. As a result, there had been no real shift in the way in which employers were treating persons as they reached the age of 65, even though life expectancy was longer. We looked at the other measures, such as persons not just transitioning from the workplace to being a pensioner, but persons transitioning from the workplace to get on financial assistance. So this week you're working, next week you can retire, and you find that you're not making ends meet, and you sign up for financial assistance. We also looked at the fact that the previous government had allowed, and it continued under this administration, for persons to retire under our early retirement incentive scheme. We found that persons were taking the early retirement incentive scheme and then knocking on the former employer's door to try to get employment back. What they found is that they couldn't sustain their financial obligations in society on the funds that they were receiving from the early retirement scheme. Working beyond the age of 65 is not uncommon in Bermuda. There are thousands of persons. I think in the last census there were 2,530 persons 65 and over working in our population. And so that gives us an idea of the capability of persons to work over 65. That number actually increased from the 2010 census. What was highlighted in the last census also was the unemployment rate for those persons 65 and over. Now, naturally, you wouldn't have an unemployment rate for those 65 and over because they won't be considered as part of the active workforce or actively seeking or looking for work. But in this particular instance, it had tripled the number of persons who were actively seeking work over the age of 65. And so it spoke about the demand in our society to make some sort of change. Changing the pension age society-wide, it's a little bit more difficult. And I think beginning with the public service is a good idea. When we looked at other societies, the majority of the developed European societies, they have removed retirement ages or are very flexible when it comes to retirement ages. And so when speaking with some colleagues currently have mortgages that will extend beyond their age of 65 due to their need to refinance during the downturn and things of that nature. And so this would help individuals a lot. But we have to look at and say, this is not just for help. This is about recognizing that people are still capable to perform at a high level at age 65. Certainly there will be some jobs which you would have to review based on their physical requirements and to determine if somebody is still capable of doing the job, and I think that's where the assessment from the supervisor is needed. I don't think it's one of those subjective things that will be put in place. You would note that all public servants are protected by the Bermuda Public Service Union, and in order for somebody to be denied, certainly it would have to have valid grounds. But I don't think the aim is to shift the retirement age to then continuously deny individuals. That makes absolutely no sense to the aims and objectives that we are trying to achieve. Like Senator Kemp did state, many persons agree to retire at age 65 through their employment contracts. And I believe many persons are not aware that they actually agree to retire at age 65 in their employment contracts when they begin employment. And if I just look at myself as a younger individual, when I am to sign an employment contract, the last thing I'm probably worrying about is 30 to 35 years down the line. And so we do have a defined retirement age specified in the National Pension Scheme legislation. It does have a clause in there that says pension age and does speak to 65, and that is the age in which the insurance companies actually abide by. What this act actually does is allow persons to work to the age of 68. We believe through our research that 68 was a good was a sufficient time period for the first adjustment. Ultimately, we're proposing that persons work up to 70, but as you know, in the public service, persons still do have rights to work up to 70, and it's at the discretion of the head of the civil service. Madam President, when we reviewed the data, it was not a one-to-one relationship with our younger workers. So it's not an older worker retires and then somehow it creates space in the public service for a younger worker. What we find in the public service is that when an older worker retires, most times their jobs are filled by a more experienced older worker. It all depends on what job category they're actually in. But based on our aging population, sometimes you replace an older Bermuda worker with a younger or older non-Bermudian worker. That can also be a factor. So it wasn't a one-to-one relationship where there is younger workers being prohibited from entering the public service because persons are working longer. You should also appreciate that the public service has a natural attrition rate, where persons leave the public service for a number of reasons. When persons leave the public service for a number of reasons, I mean, that also creates opportunities for persons to come in and fill vacant posts. These provisions also go a long way in creating a more sustainable public service superannuation fund. Obviously, if persons are working longer, they are contributing more, and also the liability the government is able to reduce its liability and defer the liability for a longer period of time, and that's positive steps. The actuaries actually advised that this will be a meaningful step, and it will give the public service superannuation fund some additional life. I think that these changes are timely, they make sense. I think that anybody viewing these changes will see that they are in benefit of our society, and I thank the government for bringing them forward. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Hayward. Would any other senator care to speak on this bill? No, then Senator Campbell, you have a couple of questions to respond to.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, it's good to have a summary by the chair of a subcommittee that put forth the recommendations, and I appreciate that coming from Senator Hayward. So from there, I will deal with the questions, Madam President, that were put forward. The first being, what happens if an employee wishes to continue to work? The doctor says they are competent to work, but the head of their department says they are not fit to continue to work. There will be no redundancy in that instance, Madam President. It would simply be a retirement at the age of 68. So they will receive their pension and the like. There was also a suggestion/question from Senator Kemp saying that this makes sense and could work in a broader sense, and being in the private sector, I assume. Is that correct, Senator, Madam President? Is that correct, that he was referring to the private sector, that this could possibly work?
Senator Kemp, you want to respond to the question?
Yes, I was referring to the broader Bermudian economy, both private and public.
Thank you.
Okay.
Carry on, Senator Campbell.
Well, that would actually fall under the Ministry of Labor and Home Affairs, and would be a matter for that ministry to consider.
Point of clarification.
The point of clarification, Senator?
I'll accept it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Carry on.
I believe the Public Service Superannuation Act would be subservient to the Employment Act, but I'm not entirely certain on that. Do you know?
We'd have to take that under consideration, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Campbell. Carry on.
Okay. And there was also one final question from regarding once a person reaches the age of 68, I think this was coming from Senator Jardine, and they choose to continue and are allowed to continue to age 70, do they still contribute to the PSSF? And the answer to that would be yes, they do. So with that, Madam President, I move that the bill entitled the Public Service Superannuation Amendment Act 2019 be now read a second time.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on, Senator Campbell.
Madam President, I move that the Standing Order 26 be suspended in respect of this bill.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on.
Madam President, I move that the bill entitled the Public Service Superannuation Amendment Act 2019 be now read a third time.
Is there any objection to the third reading? No objection. Carry on.
Madam President, I move that the bill do now pass.
It has been moved that the bill entitled the Public Service Superannuation Amendment Act 2019 do now pass. Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. The bill is passed. Thank you, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam President.
The second order of the day is the Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019. I believe that's Senator Campbell's. The second bill is yours as well.
That's
Senator
correct, Madam
Campbell.
President.
You have the floor when you're ready.
Madam President, I move that the bill entitled Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019 be now read a second time.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I am pleased to present the Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019, the Act, for the consideration of the Senate. The bill seeks to enhance Bermuda's supervisory and regulatory regime for those engaged in fund administration, provider business, an important segment of Bermuda's financial services sector. Madam President, by way of background, in March 2018, a discussion paper entitled Proposed Enhancements to Investment Business, Investment Funds, and Fund Administration Regimes was issued by the Bermuda Monetary Authority, the BMA or Authority. As indicated in this paper, input from industry stakeholders was sought regarding proposed modifications to the frameworks in place for these sectors. Following the feedback received from the discussion paper, the authority made a commitment in its 2018 business plan to support the introduction of the legislative proposals in respect of fund administration business. And this proposal involves enacting a new standalone Fund Administration Act, the Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019. Madam President, the Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019 is the first of a series of enhancements to the investment business and investment funds regimes proposed in the March 2018 discussion paper. Madam President, the Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019 is derived from the original Investment Funds Act 2006, IFA from now on, which provides the legislative basis for Bermuda's investment fund and fund administration business. While the IFA 2006 has been subject to amendments over time, these amendments have tended to be ad hoc in nature, addressing specific issues and particular circumstances related to investment fund vehicles. However, with the evolution of the fund business, it is the authority's view that its oversight of fund administration businesses and investment fund products will each be better accomplished via separate legislative frameworks. Furthermore, introducing a legislative regime that is specific to fund administrators will put this sector on the same footing as other regulated financial institutions in Bermuda. Madam President, the authority has proposed that a majority of the existing provisions within the IFA related to fund administration business, predominantly found within Part 3 of the IFA, be incorporated in the new Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019. When developing the new act, the authority sought to ensure that relevant provisions of the IFA were updated where appropriate in the new framework, so as to be consistent with how comparable provisions are presented within recently adopted legislation covering other regulated financial institutions. Madam President, the new Fund Administration Provider Act 2019 seeks to provide consistency and clarity in respect of how fund administrators exercise their functions and how the authority supervises them. Key aspects of the regime for fund administrators which have been subject to enhancement in the new act include carrying on fund administration business in or from within Bermuda, safeguarding of other assets for clients, minimum criteria for licensing, statement of principles, reporting requirements, and new code of practice. Madam President, I will now elaborate on each of these points. Point 1, carrying on fund administration business in or from within Bermuda. This section is derived from Section 41, Part 3 of the IFA and is a core element of the current fund administration business regime. This section prohibits a person from carrying on the business of a fund administrator in or from within Bermuda without a license. The authority believes that additional certainty is required with regard to when one would be considered to carry on or purport to carry on the business of a fund administrator in or from Bermuda. Accordingly, this legislation provides that fund administrators will correctly be regarded as carrying on fund administrative business within Bermuda if they occupy premises in Bermuda or make known by way of a website, promotional materials, legal documents, or letterheads that they may be contacted at a particular address in Bermuda, or are otherwise seen to be holding themselves out as engaging in or carrying on fund administrator business in or from within Bermuda. Furthermore, the Act makes it clear that a company incorporated in Bermuda shall not carry on the business of a fund administrator anywhere in the world without being licensed by the authority. Point 2, safeguarding of other assets. The Act makes provision for Bermuda licensed fund administrators to provide, subject to a specific application process, certain safeguarding services for other assets only, and not in respect of financial instruments or client monies. It is intended that fund administrators which provide any such safeguarding services will be subject to additional obligations which will be contained within regulations which can be made by the Minister of Finance pursuant to the new Act and an updated code of practice which the authority will be empowered to issue. Licensees who are granted permission to provide such safeguarding services in respect of their clients' other assets will be subject to additional reporting and disclosure obligations, including the requirement to prepare audited financial statements submitted to the authority on an annual basis. Madam President, point 3, minimum criteria for licensing. The minimum criteria for licensing of fund administrators is currently set out in the schedule to the IFA. The authority must be satisfied that the minimum criteria are met and continue to be met by entities seeking to be licensed or which are currently licensed as fund administrators. The new Act updates the existing minimum criteria for licensing to ensure that the provisions contained therein are consistent, where appropriate, with those reflected within recently adopted legislation covering other regulated financial institutions. For example, Madam President, the Act strengthens the existing requirement for business to be conducted in a prudent manner by adding a provision specific to maintaining adequate accounting and other records, along with accompanying systems of control and associated policies and procedures. Also, further emphasis is given to corporate governance obligations by reflecting these obligations independently rather than as a subset of the fit and proper persons criteria. Madam President, in relation to point 4, Statement of Principles, the new Act requires the authority, consistent with other supervisory acts for financial service providers, to publish as soon as practicable after the legislation comes into force a Statement of Principles which identifies the manner in which the authority proposes to act in respect of A, interpreting the minimum criteria specified in the schedule to the Act and grounds for revocation, B, exercising its power to grant, revoke, or restrict a license, C, exercising its power to obtain information, reports, and to require production of documents, and D, exercising its powers to impose a civil penalty, censure publicly, make prohibition order, and publish information about any matter to which a decision notice relates. Point 5, reporting requirements. Section 47 of the IFA requires fund administrators to submit an annual statement of compliance to the authority, but the information to be included in this statement is general in nature. In keeping with international best practice in this area, the Act expands and makes more specific the requirements of the statement of compliance by way of A, requiring that the statement of compliance be signed by 2 directors, one of whom must be the chief executive or equivalent officer, B, introducing more extensive confirmation requirements, and C, providing the authority with power to, upon application, grant an extension in relation to the filing of an annual statement of compliance. Madam President, also it is proposed that fund administrators be subject to new requirements with respect to the filing of annual financial statements, including a requirement for the appointment of an auditor and the filing of annual audited financials in the instance where the fund administrator has been approved to provide safekeeping service for the client's other assets. Madam President, in relation to point 6, Code of Practice, the Act makes provision for such a code to be issued. In this regard, it is proposed that the existing Code of Conduct for fund administrators be revised to achieve alignment with, among other things, the revisions to be made to the minimum criteria for licensing. Madam President, I can confirm that there are currently 27 fund administrators licensed under the existing IFA regime, which we would expect to be licensed under the new regime once it comes into force. Madam President, I wish to emphasize the authority sought input from stakeholders on all these provisions in March 2018 by means of the aforementioned discussion paper and also via a consultation paper and draft bill issued in April 2019. This bill represents a collaborative effort between the authority and various industry stakeholders. Accordingly, I would like to thank all of those persons within the Bermuda Monetary Authority, the Attorney General's Chambers, the Ministry of Finance, and the private sector who have assisted with the development of this bill. And with those remarks, Madam President, I pause to allow other senators to speak. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Campbell. And before we do that, I would just like to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Eiffel Hughes from the Bermuda Monetary Authority, who's in the chamber this morning. Thank you. Would any senator care to speak? Senator Kemp, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. We understand that there was sufficient industry consultation, and we have no objections to this bill.
Thank you, Senator Kemp. Would any other senator care to speak on this bill? No, then it seems you have full support. Senator Campbell, over to you.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, senators, for your support. Madam President, I move that the bill entitled Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019 be now read a second time.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on, Senator Campbell.
Madam President, I move that Standing Order 26 be suspended in respect of the bill.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on.
Madam President, I move that the bill entitled Fund Administration Provider Business Act 2019 be now read a third time.
Is there any objection to the third reading? No objection.
Madam President, I move that the bill do now pass.
It has been moved that the bill entitled the Fund Administration Provider Business Act do now pass. Is there an objection to that motion? No objection. The bill is passed. Thank you, Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Madam President.
We now move on to the third item for the orders of the day, and that is the second reading of the Employment Wage Commission Act 2019. Senator Hayward, your bill, you have the floor.
Madam President, I move that the bill entitled Employment Wage Commission Act 2019 be now read a second time.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on, Senator Hayward.
Madam President, I am pleased to introduce the bill entitled the Employment Wage Commission Act 2019, which seeks to set up a wage commission in order to report on and recommend a minimum and living wage regime for Bermuda. Madam President, as my Senate colleagues will be aware, on the 10th of August 2018, a motion was brought before the House of Assembly for the consideration and approval of the Parliamentary Joint Select Committee's report on the establishment of a minimum living wage regime. Among other recommendations in the report is the establishment of a wage commission. Madam President, the report was approved, and the November 28th Throne speech confirmed government's commitment to implementing a minimum living wage regime. Madam President, the International Labor Organization, or ILO, as it is commonly referred to, defines minimum wage as, and I quote, the minimum amount of remuneration that an employer is required to pay wage earners for the work performed during a given period, which cannot be reduced by collective agreement or an individual contract. The purpose of a minimum wage is to protect workers against unduly low pay. Madam President, the days of Bermudians being able to pick up and choose jobs are gone. The current economic climate puts the demand and supply equation for labor in the employer's favor. Unskilled workers now have to compete for jobs, and exploitation of workers is occurring. We have all heard of people who are making $5, $6, $7 an hour, and this is occurring in Bermuda, which has one of the highest costs of living globally. To illustrate, Madam President, honorable members may be aware of a job advert earlier this year in which persons were looking to hire a living caregiver. The job responsibilities listed were to take care of an elderly person suffering from dementia, clean, cook, provide companionship, run errands, work 5 days a week from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and do on call 7 nights a week. The successful candidate would have 2 days off, but would have to prep meals before leaving and make $10 an hour, less room and board. Madam President, I think we could all agree that this embodies the term exploitation. Madam President, this bill seeks to provide for the establishment of a wage commission which will be mandated to inquire into the provisions of a statutory wage scheme with the objective of making recommendations on a minimum hourly wage and a living wage rate, which will be prescribed by the minister responsible for labor. Madam President, The composition of the Wage Commission will consist of a total of 8 persons, a chairman, 5 members, 2 ex officio members representing the Ministry of Finance and the ministry responsible for labor. Members will be appointed by the minister responsible for labor for a period of 3 years and have broad experience and expertise in economics, law, statistics, and other suitable qualifications. Provisions will be made to pay the members of the Commission in accordance with the Government Fees Act 1971. The fee is set at $100 per meeting for the chairman and $50 per meeting for the members. A consequential amendment to the Government Authorities Fees Act 1971 will be made. Madam President, to facilitate the proceedings of the Commission, the bill authorizes the Minister to designate a public officer to be the Secretary to the Commission, thereby reducing the need for additional administrative costs. Madam President, the bill stipulates that the functions of the Commission are to make recommendations on the minimum hourly wage and the living wage rate. To fulfill this mandate, the Commission is required to conduct research, inquiries, and analysis, and consult extensively to ensure that all stakeholders, including employers and employees, and organizations representing employers and employees, have the opportunity to make a contribution. Should the Commission require information from employer or employee or some other person, they will be able to compel persons in writing to supply the information and appear before the Commission. The Commission will also have the power to take copies of the documentation provided. Madam President, every 3 years, the Commission will be required to make a report to the Minister responsible for labor with regards to the proposed minimum hourly wage. It may be necessary for a review within the 3-year cycle in the event of a significant economic change in Bermuda or unforeseen consequences of the minimum or living wage that need to be researched and rectified. Madam President, the bill sets out the requirements for the content of the report the Commission is to submit to the Minister, which include, number 1, determinations of the Commission on the findings and conclusions of the research, inquiries, and consultations and recommendations, and the subsequent recommendations and reasons for the recommendations. Madam President, the bill requires that the recommendations must include an analysis of the impact on the economy of Bermuda, the competitiveness of the economy of Bermuda, and any other issue that may have been raised by the Minister responsible for labor. Madam President, once the Minister has received the report, he will be obliged to table it for the House of Assembly and the Senate, and may by order prescribe the minimum hourly wage. Madam President, a living wage is different from a minimum hourly wage in that it purports to provide a decent standard of living for the worker and his or her family. Madam President, as with the minimum hourly wage, the Commission is also mandated to make a report to the Minister responsible for labor every 3 years with a proposed living wage rate. The requirements for the production of the report are the same for the determination of the living wage rate as they are for the minimum hourly wage. Once the Minister has received the report, he or she must table it in both houses of the legislature and may by order prescribe the living wage rate. Madam President, the Commission's powers are accompanied by enforcement measures. Persons who fail to produce any record, document, or information intentionally delay the work of the Commission or refuse to answer any questions are subject to a fine not exceeding $2,000 and $100 for every day that the offense continues. In the case of a corporate entity, the fine will be $7,000 and $500 for every day that the offense continues. Madam President, the bill provides a regulation and order-making power for the Minister which will enable him or her to prescribe the minimum hourly wage, the living wage rate, and any matter that are necessary for carrying out the provisions of the bill. The regulations will be made in due course following the Wage Commission report and recommendations. Madam President, we are clearly well behind the times internationally in the establishment of a minimum wage. The ILO asserts that more than 90% of their 186 member states have one or more minimum wages set through legislation or binding collective agreements. Today, we are on the road to making a living wage a reality for Bermuda. Our people deserve to live in dignity. They deserve to enjoy decent work, and a part of that is to provide for a living wage, and this legislation will make it happen. In conclusion, I would like to thank the Parliamentary Joint Select Committee for their work in the production of the report on the establishment of a minimum living wage regime. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Hayward. I would, at this time, like to acknowledge the presence of the Permanent Secretary, Chris Farrow, Policy Analyst, as well as Jane Brett, Policy Analyst. Sorry, Jane Brett is the Policy Analyst, but anyway, the Senate welcomes both of you to the Senate. And now back to business at hand. Would any senator care to speak on this bill? Senator Kemp, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Senator Hayward. Certainly, ensuring that people are able to live in Bermuda on what the most basic of pay rates allows is an important thing to ensure that we achieve. What I'm certainly struggling with, and this is where I guess the devil's always in the details, is when I was on the Joint Select Committee that seems to have preceded this commission that will then determine what the wage is, one of the key things or at least I struggled with, was the detail of breakdown that we could get from the Office of the Tax Commissioner. Obviously, and this seems to have fallen off a bit with the Living Wage Commission Act from the motion laid in another place that set up the Joint Select Committee, that seemed to target the effect of foreign workers on lowering the essentially market price for labor at the lower end of the pay scale, and how that effect may have had on Bermudian workers. But again, that was the assumption put forward in the motion, and it was really hard to find the supporting data behind that, because the payroll tax commission could say that certain industries paid X or Y, but they couldn't say to whom on a kind of broader demographic scale they were falling to. So that made it kind of difficult to understand what the effect of the living wage would have on different groups of people. Obviously, there is a living wage for someone working in Bermuda with a family, with children, with all these things in Bermuda. And I notice on the Wage Commission Act now, the cost of childcare is included under the living wage. So, and again, this raised problems when we were discussing it theoretically at the Joint Select Committee level, was with, well, how do you set the wage on no children, 1 child, 2 children, 3 children, etc.? And as those are individuals' choices, is that a burden that should be borne by an employer, by the government? How are we passing on these costs? And if a certain wage was raised, would all that income would that all of a sudden entice Bermudians to work in those industries? Would it be simply increasing the amount of foreign cash sent overseas for people that are able to essentially reduce their cost of living in Bermuda as they're looking for economic opportunity and this kind of thing? And I say that not that there's a clear distinction between exploitation and people who choose to say bunk as an adult because they're spouses and children are back home, and that's a beneficial short-term economic position for them. The other struggle was with tipped wages, and the numbers from the payroll tax commissioners and other reports seem to only capture what is the base pay and not the amount of money earned in gratuities. So one could say someone's earning $8 an hour as a flat wage, but they could effectively be taking home 24, 25 because of the way that industry has developed its payment and reimbursement culture based on kind of a profit share on volume of business done. And there didn't seem to be any really good data for us to make decisions, and what positions taken could adversely affect the employees, adversely affect the business operators, and or completely cost out hospitality as a destination, depending on which way those assessments were made. But again, there was a rather glaring lack of kind of economic data which we could come to unbiased recommendations on. So I'm assuming that the reason another commission was set up after the previous committee was to continue to academically research this and get some good data so that we can have a policy that protects employees, ensures that the cost of business and the cost of living in Bermuda aren't radically skewed, and that allow people that want to work, that they don't feel like they're being excluded simply because there's exploitation level wages or expectations coming out of it. So we certainly support the continued work of this commission, but we'd like to see what comes out of it at the end, and how much consultation and research has been done accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kemp. Would any other senator care to speak? Senator Jardine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, there are many studies and articles surrounding the subject of minimum wage and the benefits, the real benefits to implementing such a regime. Obviously, there are also studies showing the possible economic downsides of implementing a minimum wage scheme as well. Additionally, while there have been attempts at calculating the so-called living wage, which is quite different from the minimum wage, as we have heard earlier on today, there are very few countries that are actually implementing a living wage on a required legal basis. There are a number of countries that have voluntary living wage amounts, but very few that have actually implemented a living wage regime. The UK is one of the few countries that has attempted to move in the direction of establishing a living wage, having recently established a new national living wage payable to workers over 25, effective in April of 2016. This wage rate is substantially higher than what was the national minimum wage rate, but in itself is not a true living wage rate. It is something less than a true living wage rate, falls somewhere in between that. And its aim is to reach a wage rate level of about 60% of the median UK earnings. A living wage rate has been determined by many countries and cities around the world, as I said, but most of them are voluntary. However, in the United States, for example, there are 122 living wage ordinances in American cities. So they're not necessarily statewide, they're not necessarily federally implemented, but there are some ordinances that exist in cities in the United States. So the living wage is not something that is new, but it is something that is being implemented in few countries around the world, and it tends to be in cities and ordinances. My own view on this complex subject is there can be real benefits to those who remain employed after the implementation of a minimum wage regime, and that the possible economic downsides depend entirely on the country in which the minimum wage is being implemented, its own economic circumstances, and probably more importantly, and just as key, the level at which the minimum wage is set. And we've heard some questions this morning about whether the minimum wage, for example, would include tipping or exclude tipping, and if so, how is it calculated? Studies have shown that some cities within countries, the implementation of a minimum wage has had a positive impact on employment, while in others it is not entirely clear what that impact has been, either negative or positive. Additionally, certain types of businesses have been affected positively or negatively more than other businesses. There are 159 countries around the world that have a minimum wage at present, and they include USA, Canada, the UK, Australia, France, Germany, and many more. The Cayman Islands, the BVI, Bahamas, Barbados, St. Kitts, Trinidad, and Tobago all have minimum wage regimes, and they have legislation in place. So again, what we're debating or what we're discussing today is not something new. Now, before I go any further, just to put everybody at rest, I want to say I am in favor of establishing a wage commission. So I'll put that behind us, and then we can move on to some other points. I think it is important we do have a wage commission. It will be the work and recommendations of this commission that will be absolutely critical in determining the outcomes of establishing a minimum wage. All those who live and work in Bermuda should be able to live with dignity, as we've heard, and be able to feel that they are not intimidated in the workplace or feel uncomfortable about complaining about the wage rate, which many feel at present. And I think we've heard that there are some employers who are taking advantage of that, both Bermudian and non-Bermudian staff. I want to say that it applies not only to the wages that some workers are being paid, but in some cases the living conditions in which some of our workers have to exist. And I don't want to let that go without some mention. It's not just the wages they're being paid, but it's the living conditions in which some of these workers are having to exist. So, Madam President, it is a delicate balance that we have to keep between paying a fair wage for a fair hour's work, whilst at the same time being alive to the effects that an increase in operating costs may have on businesses in Bermuda. And as I said during our discussion on the amendments to the Health Insurance Act, a company has a number of options that they can adopt when costs go up, one of which is simply to increase the price that it charges for its goods and services. So as was stated in another place 10 days ago, Bermuda's cost of living is a major concern for Bermudians. And when the Wage Commission meets to consider a minimum wage, it will, as required under Section 10 of this bill before us, Madam President, have to make a conclusion, if I may quote from Section 10.
You certainly may.
It says, and specifically state the effect of the determination made on the economy of Bermuda as a whole. So that's one of its requirements that it has to fulfill as it comes up with a minimum wage. The big question is, will the establishment of a minimum wage and eventually a real living wage result in a loss of jobs? As I've said already, there is an enormous amount of literature on this topic, and there are studies which suggest that there will be job losses and others that show that there will not be job losses. There's a huge amount of literature out there, and I must say I didn't plow through all of it, but plowed through some of it. And I just wanted to refer to one or two pieces. The first one is an economic report written by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, dated December 21st, 2015, and they conclude on page 5 of their report after examining a great deal of evidence, and if I may quote them, Madam President,
Certainly may.
they say as follows: coupled with critiques of the methods that generate little evidence of job losses, the overall body of recent evidence suggests that the most credible conclusion is a higher minimum wage results in some job loss for the less skilled workers, with possibly larger adverse effects than earlier research suggests. Now, the key to that is And I just want to repeat that. The conclusion is a higher minimum wage results in some job losses. So to me, the critical point is, what rate do you set for the minimum wage? And that will determine, to some extent, whether or not it has any significant impact on existing jobs. So it's important the Commission get the minimum wage rate right. And I'll make one further interesting observation from a detailed study carried out by Meir and West from Texas A&M in 2015, in which they conclude as follows, and if I may quote them, Madam President. They say the following: the voluminous literature on minimum wages offers little consensus on the extent to which a wage floor impacts employment. We argue that the effect of the minimum wage should be more apparent in new employment growth than in employment levels, and that's key, new employment growth rather than current employment levels. We find that the minimum wage reduces net job growth primarily through its effect on job creation by expanding establishments. So that's establishments that are already existing and looking to expand. These effects are most pronounced for younger workers and in industries with a higher proportion of low-wage workers. So they also say in their report, and I didn't quote it here, but they also say in their report that for new businesses that are seeking to establish, they'll be looking at the minimum wage rate, and if it's of a sufficiently high level, they will look to automate in a more effective way rather than hire additional staff. So I just wanted to stress that. They're talking about new employment growth, not necessarily those jobs that already exist. So, Madam President, you know, there are many information papers available online which shows that certain jurisdictions have dealt with determining minimum wage in different ways. Now, I know I'm going to be criticized for referring to our neighbors to the south, but we can learn from them as they have learned from us many times in the past. And if you will allow me just to mention one.
Absolutely.
And I'm referring to the Cayman Islands. They went through this exact same process in 2015. And their minimum wage advisory committee report, issued in February of 2015, was extremely informative. Now, it's 220 pages, and I'm sure people don't want to plow through it all, but if you do plow through it, it sets out a very good guideline of what they followed in coming up with their minimum wage. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should just blindly copy what they did, but it does provide something for our wage commission to at least read, if they haven't already read it, to give them some idea of how they might want to approach coming up with a minimum wage. And it includes a lot of things that are mentioned in our bill here that should be considered. They actually go through the process, and you can see how they've determined what, for example, economic impact it would have. Now, they've set their minimum wage at $6 Caymanian per hour, which is about $7.20 U.S. per hour. So as I say, they actually also brought in the ILO to give them advice, and we've heard Senator Hayward refer to them in his opening remarks. They were heavily involved in their process as well. The report from the Bermuda Joint Select Committee on this report was also very informative, and I did go through all of that several times, and it showed the work that they'd carried out. And it also acknowledged on page 9 of their report, and if I can quote it, Madam President, because I think it's important again.
You certainly
And they said as follows: it is acknowledged that the analysis conducted has limitations, and the members are also cognizant of the unintended consequences that can arise if this process is not well consulted and well thought out. So they themselves recognize that the process that this commission has to go through has to be fairly consultative, it has to be fairly detailed, so the rate that they come up with at the end of the day is something that is fully supported. Madam President, on pages 13 to 21 of the Joint Select Committee, and again, they came up with certain insights. They provided certain insights to the various methodologies that are used throughout the world, and I believe there were 3 different versions. And it was useful to see that, and one of those, indeed, was the one that was selected by Cayman in coming up with their minimum wage rate. The Joint Select Committee also recognized the importance of the effect of the minimum wage levels on the cost of living in Bermuda. So they don't just blindly send this out. They did actually consider it, and I wanted to quote specifically from them, and I'm looking at Senator Richardson because I think he's going to fall into play here, and it says, if I may quote them, Madam President, they say, the Cost of Living Committee is equally as important as they review the competitive economic environment to assess whether or not a lack of competition within key economic sectors artificially inflates the cost of goods and services. So there's a sort of dynamic role being played by the Cost of Living Committee and by this commission working in tandem as they go through this process. And again, that's a very, in my mind, a very important process. So, Madam President, there's a huge amount of literature out there, and I think it's what you read today may be different from what you read yesterday. I think the key point I want to get across here is that the level that is set for the minimum wage will determine what impact it has on cost of living. It will impact, probably going forward, not so much for the existing jobs, but for job creation. It will impact the jobs that may or may not be created in the future. And I think that's important. There were two comments I wanted to make on the bill itself. And the first, if I may refer to them, Madam President, was clauses 3.2a, 4, B1, gets very complicated, and clause 3.4, addressing young persons. And I see that the Act does not apply to anyone under the age of 16, but any students above the age of 16, subject to certain requirements of other acts, are caught by this Act. And it just seemed to me that if we are going to say that students between the ages of 16 and let's just say 22 or 23 are subject to this Act, and therefore those higher rates have to be paid, that may have an impact on summer employment or indeed on holiday employment. If the rates are too high, businesses that might normally have taken students in and paid them something fair and reasonable just simply may not hire them. So my concern is if students between the ages of 16 and say 22 are impacted and do have to fall under this regime, they may find it more difficult to obtain jobs. And I just sort of sound that note of caution and concern. And again, there are studies out there that have shown that in fact it has had no impact, and studies that show that it has had an impact. So I think we just need to be alive to that one. Clause 7 appears to give the Commission fairly broad powers to request information, and I quote from the section, such records or documents as they may request. Madam, I understand that the Commission needs to get information, and they should get information that's relevant to the work that they do. My concern is that they want to get information that's relevant to what they're doing, and hopefully will not be looking for information that's not relevant. And I guess one small amendment that I would suggest maybe that the government look at and consider, and it's in Clause 7A, which could read, for example, to supply that information and to produce such record or documents as may be specified, which, and this is the bit that I would add, might reasonably be required. Now, I suppose I'm not a lawyer, but that seems to be a term that lawyers love to use, that might reasonably be required because they can argue that it's not reasonably required. But it's just something that I think as a cautionary note might be worthwhile adding so that people don't go on fishing expeditions for stuff that is not relevant to the job at hand. And I think that that's something that should be considered. So, Madam President, as I said in my earlier comments, I support this establishment of a wage commission. I believe there are people working on this island who are paid far below subsistence levels, and again, it may be by choice and that they are prepared to be paid that and are quite happy with it, and probably just as important are those that feel they don't have any other choice. They need to have a job, so they take whatever wage is on offer, and they're being paid at well below a reasonable subsistence level. I want to finish with my own personal comments that I said earlier, but also comments from another place, well, not another place, another island, I should say. As I've stated earlier, I think it's very important that the minimum wage that is set is carefully thought through. And so I want to really conclude my comments by supporting that thought by, again, quoting from the Cayman Islands Minimum Wage Advisory Committee report, and I'm sure I'm going to be chastised for all these quotes from them, but I think it's very relevant, and it sums up in my complete thoughts on this. And if I may quote from them on page 77 of their report, they say as follows: "The aim should therefore be to establish a framework for a minimum wage that strikes a balance, or as I would say, Madam President, the right balance, and which is beneficial to the labor market supply while remaining affordable to employers and not seen as hampering businesses and the economy." Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Jardine. Would any other senator care to speak on this bill? Sorry, Senator Richardson, you have the floor.
Hi, good morning, Madam President, sorry.
Good morning.
Fellow senators and this listening audience. As is typical in these debates and conversations, we do necessarily think through the financial and economic aspects. But what I want to do, Madam President, is preface my comments with two short, real conversations that I've had in the recent past in preparation for today. One was I was talking to a guest worker, a professional person, and he was going through talking about his experience. He's been in Bermuda for about less than 2 years now. And I was asking, as we normally do, how's it going and what have you. And he said, well, one day he had an experience whereby he works in an office and someone had been dismissed. And the person came to him in a different situation and said, it's because of people like you that Bermudians don't have jobs. And he talked to him in terms of, first of all, the person who made the accusation did not know what this person was, what their job was. And then after conversation, he talked about the idea that he was a qualified accountant, and the person that was dismissed was effectively a handy person, but often turns up late and all the rest of it. So there was, in his mind, justification for that person to have been dismissed. But then he went on to talk about the idea that some of the things that he has seen, his perspective for Bermuda was that Bermuda is a land of opportunity. And then he talked about from his homeland, or from where he lives, that they have a different perspective in terms of you don't necessarily have, for example, 3 meals a day, and you don't live in a place that's reasonably comfortable in those things. And so we talked about what is effectively a mindset. And so I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Another conversation I had was with another friend who is visiting from the U.S., but lived in one of the islands before he went to the U.S. And we did a bit of a drive around Bermuda, and then we went on a boat tour. And, naturally, as you're driving or on a boat, you give comments about what you see, and he was quite taken aback by what he saw as Bermuda's extreme wealth. And we did go around, around the harbor and up to Morgan's Point and all the rest of that. And then further on, we talked about the idea that, yes, this may be what you see, but the reality is, in the Bermudian context, it is superficial. Because there are many, 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 many people who could not possibly afford to live in some of these accommodations and who do get paid quite a minimal salary in that respect. And so, for me, yes, I understand, of course, that there are the financial impacts, but there is a human element to what we're talking about today. And I think that has to be brought to the fore also as part of this discussion. Because notwithstanding what we may see sometimes on the surface, the reality is that the costs of, say, fuel and food and vehicles, electricity, bank fees, and all the rest of it, they are the same for all of us, irrespective of how much money we may earn. And even as recently as this weekend, I was doing some online banking, and I said to myself, there was a furor in the recent past when both banks increased their banking fees, but now it's died down. But the reality is you still have to pay those fees. So a $10 per month per account fee and a 50-cent per fee for online transfers. And I know from my previous job, that those things will add lots to the bank's bottom line, but we will not necessarily remain focused on those things beyond the initial complaints when it took place. And so I'll leave that there. My other comment to bring to focus is that, again, what we are used to is a capitalist society. And the reality is that capitalism is based on exploitation. So as a business owner, what I'm going to try to do is set my prices as high as I can And to the extent that I employ you or anybody else that matter, I'm going to pay you as little as possible to ensure that my profits are maximized. And that is one of those realities for us in Bermuda. And my comments may be a bit stark, I suppose, but we have come to accept that. And even as we go about our daily lives, we don't necessarily object to the idea of one person becoming very wealthy while other persons are just able to manage. And I'm saying all that to say that part of this work and part of what we have to adjust to is the whole mindset now in terms of really for all persons who are involved in business and also the workers is how much is enough? To what degree are we prepared to continue to allow to have the excesses of wealth in the context of persons who are not able to really manage? There were comments earlier in terms of what will the reference point be for setting initially the minimum wage and ultimately the living wage, and should there be an impact in terms of do I as the employee have one child or two children or whatever the case may be, and am I married otherwise? And the reality is that while each job may not be evaluated based upon my circumstances, we have to factor that into what we do because the community, the broader-based community, right, is starting in a big way to see the impact of persons not able to manage their daily financial obligations. And so we have to really, in my mind, press pause and think about that. And yes, there are going to be some financial implications in terms of whatever the rates are set at. But at some level, the question is a job worth existing even if the person is only going to be paid, say, $5 an hour? Because we also have situations in Bermuda whereby, and I think Senator Jardine referred to this, some persons earn such little wages that they cannot afford to live except there are multiple persons living in an accommodation. And I think we have heard, we may know ourselves personally, but we've certainly heard anecdotally whereby you may have a one-bedroom apartment, for example, with up to 6 occupants, because that's what they have to do in order to afford the Bermuda rents. And in many cases, I think when we hear about it anecdotally, it refers to some of the non-Bermudian workers who are here being paid very low wages. But there are also many Bermudians that have the same circumstance, in that you may have more than one family living in very, very small accommodation, and then from that we see multiple dysfunctional social implications or impacts. And so to go back to the person who I talked to initially about what we're used to, it's for us to now start to contemplate a difference, and that yes, there may be, and I guess there are going to be some job losses, but some of those job losses may even be done as an excuse. And as a business owner, part of the conversation and consideration is, okay, if you're making X amount of money, what amount of that should really be shared with the workers? Because at some level, listen, if you're making X amount, why can't more be shared? And again, that's what I'm talking about the shift in mindset that we have to go through. And it's not easy because from a business perspective, it's, I've taken the risk. It's my idea. My money's on the line. I have to pay bank loans and all the rest of it. But I think that's going to be a challenge for us as Bermuda society now in terms of like going forward. Really, what is going to be our emphasis in ensuring that Bermuda as a society is able to continue as we go forward. And having said that, I do recognize that there are several marginal businesses in Bermuda, and what I mean by that is that there are some that are not making a profit in the full context of what a profit is, and in some cases, it's evidenced by persons saying that my employer is stealing from me as an employee. And that arises because I might pay you, let's say, $1,000 a week in this instance, and I make deductions for health insurance and pensions and all the rest of it, and I don't then pay those across to where they're supposed to go. and that's where the accusation arises. But in some cases, I have a very marginal business, and I don't have the amount of money in any event to pay all those deductions, and that's why I do what I do. I'm not justifying that, but I am saying that there are going to be some circumstances by which those businesses may falter, but I justify that by saying that is it appropriate for that business to be in existence if it cannot really fulfill its own obligations? And again, it's for us to start thinking through that these are going to be some of the realities of doing what is being proposed by the Wage Commission, but it has to be a fallout. It is what it is in that sense. And when it comes to my example in terms of profitability helping to determine what the impact should be on workers, if we go back to probably the late 1980s or early 1990s, there was huge discussion from a negotiation point of view between the unions and the hotel association, effectively. And the push back and forth was around, well, what is the profitability of the hotels in order to justify what the unions were demanding or requesting. And ultimately what they did was they individually sent the information to Price Waterhouse. Price Waterhouse was then able to aggregate the data on a confidential basis and then give it back, since the people knew, generally speaking, what the hotel industry was doing, and that then gave a more realistic basis for the negotiations to continue, and obviously but then ultimately get to a successful outcome. And so those are some of the things we're going to have to do that may be radical to really understand if the minimum wage is really the reason why someone becomes unemployed, or is it the business interest being ultimately selfish in its decision? So rather than me have a lesser profit, I'll dismiss you. And I'm saying in my mind, that is sometimes an excuse. We have to start figuring out what is realistic if we are serious about living in Bermuda going forward. It's a serious conversation to be had. And so, Madam President, I am one of those that certainly look forward to the work of the Commission, all of the analysis and the reference points that they will use. And from a business perspective, yes, I am prepared to consider what will have to happen in terms of ultimately sharing more of the business income with the workers. And as a final comment, going back to the person that we were going on the cruise with, he works in the medical profession as a partner in an entity, and he suggested to his fellow partners that that the profit of the business should be shared on a bonus basis with both the physicians, the nurses, and the rest of the person that worked in the medical facility. And he was challenged by effectively, what is wrong with you? Why would you want to do that? And I'm saying that that's the reality, that if there is profits being made, there may have to be a different basis upon which we really consider sharing those profits. And the final comment, Madam President, which I think was referenced by Senator Jardine, is that I want to say back in the day when it came to tips, you may be aware, senators may be aware that a lot of Bermudians worked in the hotel industry as part of going between, say, age 16 and probably 20 or 22 or 25, for that matter, during university. And at that stage, what used to happen is, number one, I would work in the dining room, and I would receive my tips in cash. There was no guaranteed gratuities in whatever the case may be. And then there was also the tips that went in a pool, and at the end of the month or the week, the maitre d' would say, okay, fine, this has been the pool of the gret, and then they were split based upon a scale between the waiters, the boss boys, and all the rest of those. And so there was much more of a direct attribution of those gratuities with the actual workers. Whereas now, in some cases, the gratuities are mandatory, they're on your bill, and so I, as the worker, do not even see that. And in some cases, we may be aware that the employers are using what is the gratuities as part of their own income. And so there is a degree of unfairness when it comes to this taking place. And so, sorry. And so, Madam President, those are my comments, and really just trying to emphasize the fact that there is a significant human element in what is being discussed. And again, I look forward to the outcomes from the Wage Commission to see how they're going to have a positive impact on the social fabric of Bermuda. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Richardson. And before I determine whether any other senator wants to speak. I'd just like to acknowledge the presence of the Permanent Secretary, Ms. Zadie Price, in the gallery, as well as Mr. Francis Richardson from the Maritime Authority. Welcome to you both. Would any other senator care to speak on this bill? Senator Jones, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and a hearty good morning to my colleagues here in the chambers and to the greater listening audience. I'm going to springboard off of what my colleague, Senator Richardson, was making very clear, and my words, the fact that we are in a capitalist society. So profit is the driving force for businesses. We know that socialism is a different animal, where most of the decision-making for an economy, for the goods and services being produced by a population is determined by the government. So there's different things driving it. So we know that in a country like Bermuda, where we know we're battling with the high cost of living, the number one ticket item in any business is the cost of its labor. Just to make a comment in regards to gratuities, having worked in the hotel business and realizing that gratuities has always been a contentious issue amongst employers and employees. We do know that earlier, in the early years, when Bermuda went through the transition of voluntary gratuities to mandatory gratuities, there was a time when employers did their best. I'm talking about in the hotel industry, not too sure about the restaurants, but I know in the hotel industry there was a certain level of gratuities that were being held by the employers to augment some of their revenues to be able to handle and underwrite the cost of labor. But since which we've had a number of agreements between the Hotel Association and the unions, I would say quite confidently that over the last 30 years, that has not been the practice. In fact, all gratuities that are received by the hotels are actually paid out to the workers. So there's none of the keeping of gratuities by the hotel employers. Because most unions will tell you they ensure that their representatives are actually given a calculation sheet of how much was generated in gratuities and how much was actually paid out to the workers. But having said that, because the employees' salaries and pay is such a large ticket item on any operations, any business operations, is very sensitive. One of the thoughts I had within the hotel industry, we know that once the hotel, Madam President, hits 70% occupancy, the employer is allowed to do layoffs. And that is the hotel's way of responding to the drop-off in business. They lay off workers so they can reduce their costs. I can possibly see hotels and the like in the future saying we want to increase that occupancy level because we've got to pay more in minimum wages. We want to be able to have some flexibility, and we may suggest that, hey, maybe that occupancy percentage should go up to 75% to allow for the wiggle room to be able to make up for the increase in the minimum wages. Now, we are in favor, definitely, of this wage commission. We realize that the number one purpose of putting together a minimum wage is to minimize the exploitation of workers in this country. We probably all around this room have been able to see examples of that happening within our community. We know for a fact that in more ways than not, our foreign workers are probably the number one targets in unfair remuneration for their work. I will say this, though, with the implementation of a minimum wage, I would like to think optimistically that there will be more of a level playing field where the foreign worker will not be as exploited as much because the statutory minimum wage limit will be in place. So we should not see as much the foreign worker being chosen over the local worker because the playing field has been leveled. We also recognize that the minimum wage should be sufficient enough to allow for a worker on the lower scale to be able to enjoy a reasonable standard of living, where they will be able to afford the basic necessities in life, food, shelter, and things of the like. But what is going to be a challenge for this particular commission is to find the sweet spot, strike the right balance between protecting the worker and at the same time creating a flexibility for companies to be able to be competitive. That's going to be very, very challenging. And in my looking at the legislation, I took note of Section 6, subsection 3. And if I'm allowed to read that, Madam President.
You certainly may.
The Commission shall, as it may be deemed necessary in the course of performing its functions under this Act, consult with employers, employees, organizations that represents both employers and employees, government departments, and any other person or body of persons. When I read that, I was struck with the word consult with those list of persons, and I felt very strongly that on that commission should be actual practitioners within the workforce that are actually dealing with the challenges of making operations and businesses work, i.e. actually having on that commission union representatives, actually having on that commission business owners that generally the majority of their employees are on the lower scale of workers, i.e. Hotel management, restaurant owners. Those are the employers that generally have workers that will be living off of the minimum wage. Because as practitioners, they'll be able to take what's theoretically decided by the commission and actually be able to apply it to day-to-day operations. I think that's very important. The question of gratuities, and one may consider a sliding scale. We know that during the off season between November and March, we know the gratuity pool is going to be very small compared to the on season. So one consideration may be made: does the minimum wage for that industry, does it have to slide based on the season that they're operating in? I will challenge you to even venture to request that the workers take less gratuities in replacement of a higher minimum wage. I wouldn't think that they would be up for that, but that is going to be a challenge, and I think there's ways of making it fair for everybody. So, in closing, Madam President, we definitely are in favor of this particular legislation. I believe it's important. I am concerned that with the minimum wage that doesn't hit the right balance, we may have the threat of employers reducing hours or not, or even hiring on a part-time basis workers as opposed to full-time workers to control that and to minimize the impact of this particular statutory minimum wage rate. So I think that needs to be looked at, and we need to be sensitive to that. But I believe this legislation strikes the right chord, goes in the right direction, and Madam President, I thank you for the time.
Thank you, Senator Jones. Would any other senator care to speak? Senator Michelle Simmons, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm going to be brief because so much has already been said about the need for establishing a wage commission. I totally support this bill, and I think, as has already been stated by Senator Hayward when he presented the brief, it's clear that Bermuda is already far behind in terms of global policy with regard to a minimum wage, and indeed, even in terms of establishing a living wage. I'm sure that all of us around this table recognize that there is exploitation happening in Bermuda, exploitation of workers who are being paid very low wages. I'm concerned that all employees who are gainfully employed in Bermuda should be treated fairly. And therefore, in terms of one's national origin, in terms of whether you are a Bermudian worker or a worker from another country, I think that workers should be paid equally in terms of workers who have similar roles in their employment contract. I would like to just take us to the bill on page 7, where we have, in part 4, the determination of living wage rate. When I read the definition or the meaning of living wage rate, and if I may share this, Madam President, I'll just read it very quickly.
Yes, you certainly may, Senator.
It says in 12:1, for the purposes of this act, living wage rate means the amount of income necessary to afford an employee and his household a socially acceptable standard of living, calculated to take into account such factors as, and there's a list. I'll come back to that list in a minute. My concern in this meaning or definition is his household, because that could mean any size household. And if people are using this as their basis for establishing a living wage, surely we need to more closely define his household. Should it be a reference-sized household? Should it be a household of 2, 3, 4, up to 10 people? I'm just concerned that that needs to be tightened up a bit. Also, with regard to the factors given in that same section, it does say, Madam President, may I read it again?
You certainly may.
It says, a socially acceptable standard of living calculated to take into account such factors as the basic cost of food, housing, clothing, medical care, child care, transportation. There's something that could be included in the list, because I know that it says such factors as, but I think it deserves its own line item in that list, because I know when I look at my monthly expenses, it's probably the largest bill that I pay, and that is utility costs, which we all know are extremely high in this country. So included in that living wage calculation, I would like to know definitely that the Commission will be looking at what this household is paying in terms of utility costs. So, Madam President, I said I would be brief. I support all of the concerns already expressed about how we need to be treating employees in this country in terms of treating them fairly. And I would just ask that the two concerns I've raised be considered. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Michelle Simmons. Would any other senator care to speak on this bill? Senator Robinson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning to listening audience and my fellow colleagues. As my colleague has stated, we do on this side agree that everyone should be paid a wage that is considered livable in the country they reside in. My concern, and I'll be brief as well, is that the livable wage may tip the scale in the favor of big business. And by that I mean, if you have a small business, and we all know small business back is against the wall right now with operating costs, aging population, and as well as lack of consumer purchasing power. Most of the bigger businesses already, most likely, I won't say as fact, but most likely already pay a certain wage that would be considered livable. So this particular legislation would affect those who are currently paying what would be considered below a livable wage, which is most likely a small business. So I am concerned that Bermudians may be hit as employees who may receive notices to become part-time, and these are things that have been brought up by senators around the table, but as consumers as well. Now, in a capitalist society that we live in, the less competition that you have tends to reflect on the level of service you receive. And I do believe that if we start to put more pressure on businesses that are up and coming, we may end up in a monopolized society where larger businesses got the ability to take and absorb the hit of a livable wage, and smaller businesses may disappear. So I wonder and hope that this is taken into account when the livable wage is created, and whether or not if these businesses do disappear, is our economy fertile enough for new businesses to rise up and take their place? Do we have any sort of idea whether or not folks will continue to take on the risk of entrepreneurship if cost of living is so high and access to capital is so restricted? So I do support a livable wage, and I do believe that in our society it is wrong for those to be making so much while others make so little. But my biggest concern is if we do go into this without considering that we may be eliminating the competitiveness of smaller business, that it may backfire on us because the livable wage will not be potent if people are unemployed. So, with those comments, Madam President, I'll close.
Thank you, Senator Robinson. Would any other senator care to speak on this bill? Senator Campbell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I believe it was hinted at that there were days in Bermuda when you can quit your job in the morning and by midday have another job. I'll even take that further. There were days or times in Bermuda when you could have 2 or 3 jobs simultaneously. And many people did so to make ends meet. Some did so they can enjoy certain benefits in life. But those days are more difficult. I wouldn't necessarily say they're gone, but they're more difficult to be able to find someone holding 2 and 3 jobs. And even if it was possible, you have to ask the question: is that a good thing? Especially when, in many times, it was a single parent who was working 2 and 3 jobs. So that begs the question as to, who's looking after the kids, and whether that has led to some of the social issues we have today. But that's for another discussion. I don't envy the task of the Employment Commission. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be extremely difficult to establish a living wage in a climate, Madam President, when Bermuda's high cost of living has received much attention relative to the rest of the world. I will focus on the fact that the Progressive Labor Party does not want to see anyone exploited in any degree, not less exploited We don't want to see exploitation at all when it comes to the amount that someone is paid. I think, we respect a business above a minimum level, a living wage level, to reward superior performance. So if an employee is demonstrating superior performance, this is not removing the choice of the employer to pay that employee a little more. It does level the playing field, but maybe not from the perspective that was mentioned earlier. It levels the playing field that it costs the same, pretty much, Madam President, to hire a Bermudian versus an overseas employee at that level. So whereas now, if an overseas worker is prepared to work for a wage that a Bermudian cannot make ends meet on, then it's skewed in their favor. I mentioned before in this chamber about the changing economic model when we were discussing the retail business. And again, small business versus big business. I mentioned at that time the big business that has the corner 3-floor story building is a dinosaur. So the newer businesses, the pop-up stores, have less overhead and may be able to absorb, and they're more nimble. Even if they have to take out a physical static presence, they're more nimble than the big businesses are will. And they may be able to absorb this better than the big businesses. I would argue, Madam President. The final area that I would like to focus on, we've spoken about the impact that this would have on businesses absorbing this greater wage. I want to talk about the other side of that equation, the persons receiving the living wage when it's actually implemented. Madam President, I can be paid $1 million. If I spend $1.5 million, I'm going to be in financial difficulty. So again, we should bring some education with this, in that as I earn more, it should go to those bills that I may have struggled to pay. It should not be an extra trip this year or any trip at all. So again, we need to bring some education, and it doesn't change the impact of some of the choices and the habits that we spoke of earlier. If I earn whatever that amount, the living wage ends up being, I have to still be smart in when I choose to do certain things in my life, if I choose to do them at all. So I still have to have smart choices. So we need to with that living wage, I would like to see an education program that, this doesn't mean that you've hit the jackpot. You still have to be smart in your choices and the things that we do in life. So with those comments, Madam President, I do support this legislation, and I think it's long overdue. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Campbell. Would any other senator care to speak? I think most people have spoken, so Senator Hayward, it's over to you.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank you, the fellow senators, for their interventions in this particular debate. I had the privilege of being on both the LAC's subcommittee responsible for the living wage report and also on the Joint Select Committee responsible for living wage. And in both of those committees, what we had to identify, first and foremost, before we even discussed whether or not the country needs a minimum living wage, is, do we have a problem? And it was acknowledged by all in both committees that we do have a problem. And so in the LAC subcommittee report, the first paragraph, we tried to identify just the basic problem in very layman's terms. And if you allow me to read that, Madam President.
You certainly may, Senator Hayward.
What is the problem? There has been a change in Bermuda's job market from employment, which was primarily in tourism, to employment predominantly in international business and related industries. This has significantly altered our economic and workforce landscape. Bermuda's economic growth and development, coupled with other economic factors, have led to a high cost of living. And while the cost of living has increased, wages in many job categories have remained stagnant. Employment statistics reveal that there are persons in Bermuda who fall in categories beneath the low-income threshold. The cost of rent, food, and other basic necessities has steadily risen over the years, while wages in many sectors have not similarly increased. Particularly during the recession, there have been instances where workers have taken a decrease in pay, which has diminished purchasing power for many households. As a consequence of the high cost of living, Bermuda is experiencing high levels of low-wage poverty. While the impact of poverty in Bermuda may not be easily recognized as it may be in other jurisdictions, over the last several years, there has been a significant increase in the number of working families seeking financial assistance and other means of social support. The demographic of persons seeking support have also changed. Historically, mainly unemployed or retired persons have sought support, but now persons who hold full-time jobs or who are underemployed also require assistance. And so that was recognized that, you know what, there's a significant portion of our population struggling. We then went to say, if that's the notion that we support, then what is the evidence to support that? And when we looked at it, we looked at the last low-income status that we had to that the Department of Statistics actually produced, and that was in 2008. And those low-income studies, the report was actually titled Low-Income Thresholds, a study of Bermuda's households in need. And that was a very important title. Low-Income Thresholds, a study of Bermuda's households in need. In need of what? In need of what in particular is this referring to? And this is in need of some sort of financial assistance, some sort of subsidy, some sort of uplift. There were 3 different measures in that one report. One was a relative low-income threshold, one was a low-income cutoff, and one was a low-income threshold. Madam President, if you allow me, I can just summarize the data that was captured in that report.
You certainly may, Senator Hayward.
As it pertains to a relative low-income threshold, in 2007, there were 3,680 households with income below the relative low-income threshold, and that was $41,000. The relative low-income threshold for a single adult household was $38,000, and there were 1,115 households that fell below the relative low-income threshold. As it pertains to a low-income cutoff, in 2017, there were 3,050 households with income below the low-income cutoff of $36,605. The low-income cutoff for a single adult household was $33,630, which translates into $646.70 per week. 12% of single adult households fall beneath the low-income cutoff. And as it pertains to the low-income threshold, the low-income thresholds study revealed that in 2007, there were 3,010 households, 3,100 households in Bermuda currently living below established low-income thresholds, which range from $27,000 per year for a single adult household to $76,000 a year for a family of 2 parents and 2 children younger than 16 years of old. And so when we look at those numbers, we say that there are persons who under any other categorization would be living in some sort of poverty. Remember, poverty is relative. to the jurisdiction you're in, and so no, we don't see those extreme levels of poverty. But based on a statistical matter, we do have households that are living in poverty. When we say households, it's important that we recognize that when we're talking about households, we're not talking about one adult all the time. Most times that adult can have children, which means that we now have children who are born into conditions that they have no control over. This translates into the government needing to put some form of policy in place. There's only a number of things that can be done. You can provide your social protection safety nets, and that's what we do through financial assistance. We can explore cost of living, but that is a very difficult measure. Or we can say that there, in certain circumstances, the wages in which individuals receive are not acceptable based on the cost of living in society. We then used another set of evidence, which was the 2015 employment survey, and we looked at the number of jobs with annual incomes less than $35,991. And that's roughly around $17 per hour on a 40-hour work week. The majority of jobs that fell underneath that measure were, number one, cooks, cashiers, waiters and waitresses, sales clerks within the retail stores. And then there were a number of other job categories. But in each of those job categories, there was roughly around 500 jobs that fell beneath that particular threshold. That's important because we can now clearly identify which industries will be mostly impacted. There's this notion that if you increase the minimum wage rate, then it would have an adverse effect on employment. But I believe you have to look at the territory that you're in and the requirement for that job. The reports, none of the reports thus far are actually conclusive. There are studies in favor and there are studies that are not in favor. But what there is no debate on is whether or not persons should be making low, unacceptable wages. See, when we focus on the pure economic argument, we fail to realize that there are a portion of workers in our community who are protected from low wage rates, and those are unionized workers. There are over 9,000 unionized workers in Bermuda, and I would venture to say all of those workers receive in their compensation package what we will consider to be above a living wage or a minimum wage rate. And each year we negotiate higher increases for those workers. But what I haven't found is where there's a trade-off between that higher wage rate that we negotiate and employers reducing their workforce. I don't find that correlation to exist. And so if it will happen, it may be a minimum impact, have a minimum impact on the overall economy. And that's why this is also important that we just approve a national workforce development plan and we ensure that we have options for persons who may be disadvantaged, retrain them so that they can work in jobs and receive a proper wage so they don't have to rely on a minimum wage or a statutory set living wage rate. A wage commission is actually the most reasonable way forward. What we wanted to avoid from a committee level is the ability for politicians to arbitrarily put in place minimum and living wage rates. There's somewhat of a science behind it. Whatever methodology that the jurisdiction chooses will be the methodology that you will use perpetually going forward. So that the only thing that changes is the inputs in the methodology and not the methodology itself. Certainly you can have revisions to your methodology, but if you have a consistent way of calculating minimum and living wages, it reduces the amount of opposition you'll get to the actual numbers. And it's a more objective way of doing things rather than a subjective way. But the ILO, in its minimum wage policy guide, actually supports that any statutory system use a tripartite model, a commission model in which you have representatives of the employers, representatives of the employees, and representatives of the government. They will come together, they will look at all the data, they would have those conversations in terms of pros and cons of the options that they may put forward, and then they will come to a position where they will recommend a rate to the minister in a report. That is the most sensible way of doing things, and so I'm glad that the government hasn't moved directly forward and put in a minimum or living wage rate in front of us, and that they put a mechanism in place. So what we can do is develop what is the best and most appropriate rates for our community based on the conditions that currently exist in our economy for this specific period of time. What my colleagues, some colleagues stated earlier in terms of exploitation and the way in which employees are abused, it's a reality. I would have spoke about the way in which non-Bermudian workers in particular are treated. And many come to Bermuda under one auspices to find out that the conditions that they accept once they get to Bermuda are very much different than what they thought. And often persons have to work for very low wages, long hours, no overtime, no real vacation, no sick leave, even though these are provisions within our Employment Act. And persons don't speak up because they feel that if they do, their employment contract will be severed. This is the reality. And so if we can put measures in place that level the playing field and create a standard across the board, at least for the wage portion of the concerns, I think we will be doing everyone in Bermuda a bit of justice. And like we said, everybody should be in a dignified work environment. Decent work should be afforded to all. Nobody should be working in precarious working conditions. I believe that the Wage Commission will come to a reasonable level. When the Joint Select Committee was mulling over what would be a minimum wage, we got to somewhere around $12.25 as being reasonable. We already have somewhat of a benchmark regarding a minimum wage. For domestic workers are the only group of workers that do have a prescribed minimum wage, and that's currently at $10 an hour. And so I don't think what we'll find is the Commission setting an unreasonable wage that creates an undue burden on business. But while we remain concerned about business interests, our priority of concern should be the workers, the people who work 9 to 5, day after day, and can't make ends meet. There's a category of workers financial assistance, and those are called low-wage earners. And they qualify as being in the low-wage earners category after the department takes into consideration what they make based on their full-time job and what the reasonable expenses are. The list in the document for living wage is not exhaustive. Different families will have different factors in terms of what comprises what is required for their living wage calculation. But what we need to do is have a suite of things done to ease the burden of living for persons in Bermuda. Taxation, progressive taxation is one. More intervention into the markets regarding the cost of living commission is another. Working to ensure that we have some sort of healthcare system that is affordable and accessible. Increase intervention regarding the rate of rents in this country. And so there's a number of things that we have to do so that persons work in have decent lives in Bermuda. But this is an absolutely necessary first step. It is the best. It is a best practice step in terms of moving forward, and this will, the results of the commission will undoubtedly have a positive effect on the lives of many workers in this country. And so, with that, Madam President, I'll conclude. And I would like to move that the Employment Wage Commission Act 2019 be now read a second time.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection.
Madam President, I would like to suspend Standing Order 26 in relation to this bill.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on.
Madam President, I now move that the Employment Wage Commission Act 2019 be now read a third time.
Is there any objection to the third reading? No objection.
With there being none, Madam President, I move that this bill do not pass.
It has been moved that the bill entitled the Employment Wage Commission Act 2019 do not pass. Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. The bill is passed. Thank you, Senator Hayward. And Senators, it is 12:30. We will break for lunch. And we'll resume at 2:15. Thank you all.